Hola chicos, bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Juani. Today we're going to practice the past tense in Spanish. Why? The reason is because the Spanish past tense can be quite complicated. For example, I've got a few friends that are learning the language, and one thing that they've struggled with is, first of all, deciphering at times when to use the imperfect and when to use the preterite past tense. But not only that, one of the most difficult things, at least for an English native speaker, is deciphering or remembering the exact conjugations that come along with both of those while you're in the middle of a conversation. So today we'll go through some exercises and some examples so that by the end of this video you'll have a lot more confidence to go out there and start speaking in the past tense in Spanish. Now, to kick things off, what we're going to do first is go through when to use the imperfect and when to use the preterite past tense. Now, let's start with the preterite past tense. When do we use it? So we use the preterite past tense when we're talking about specific past actions or events that had a clear beginning and ending, so to speak, and that have also been completed as well. Now, if that doesn't quite make sense, let me show you by going through a few examples. Por ejemplo, yesterday I went to the supermarket. Ayer fui al supermercado. Ayer fui al supermercado. This morning I had to go shopping. Esta mañana tuve que ir de compras. Esta mañana tuve que ir de compras. Last week I trained with Juan. La semana pasada entrené con Juan. La semana pasada entrené con Juan. Now, after looking at those three examples, are you starting to see the pattern? We're talking about specific one-time events or actions that have a clear beginning and ending. So I hope this is helping. Before we move on, let's go through one more example. I learned a lot in my last Spanish class. Aprendí mucho en mi última clase de español. Aprendí mucho en mi última clase de español. Great work, everyone. I hope that's starting to make sense. Let's now move on to the imperfect past tense. When would you use the imperfect past tense in Spanish? So we would use it when we're talking about habitual, ongoing actions or events in the past that oftentimes don't have a clear beginning or ending. So again, if that doesn't make sense, let me show you a few examples. When I was a kid, I used to live in New Zealand. Cuando yo era niño, vivía en Nueva Zelanda. Cuando yo era niño, vivía en Nueva Zelanda. Next example, when I was 20, I used to work in the mines. Cuando tenía 20 años, trabajaba en las minas. Cuando tenía 20 años, trabajaba en las minas. Again, everyone, are you starting to notice the pattern here, describing habitual or ongoing events that have occurred in the past? We're not describing one-off actions like we were before when we're going through the preterite past tense. We're describing ongoing actions. Before we move on to another example, one really important thing to be aware of with the imperfect past tense is the good thing is where there's one less conjugation that we have to learn, because oftentimes the yo form for a verb is the same as the él, ella, or usted conjugation. So that's a good thing, but just be aware that sometimes in a conversation you might have to use the pronouns. You might have to say yo, or you might have to say él or ella, just so that the listener knows exactly who you're speaking about. Moving on, I think you're starting to understand it now, but let's try one more example. When I was 10, I used to like going to the park with my friends. Cuando tenía 10 años, me gustaba ir al parque con mis amigos. Cuando tenía 10 años, me gustaba ir al parque con mis amigos. Great work, everyone. So now I'm going to put you to the test. Coming up, I've got 4 exercises coming up for you where I'm going to give you a sentence in English and then I'm going to repeat it again in Spanish, and your job is to decipher whether to use the imperfect or whether to use the preterite past tense. So let's get into it. El número 1. When I was young, I used to study every day. Would it be cuando yo era joven estudiaba todos los días, or cuando fui joven estudié todos los días? It would of course be the first one. Cuando yo era joven estudiaba todos los días. El número dos, I moved to Australia in 2014. Would you say me mudaba a Australia en 2014 o me mudé a Australia en 2014? Of course, in this example, you'd say me mudé a Australia. Why? Because we're talking about a one-time action, which means we'll use the preterit past tense. Moving on to the next one. Yesterday, my son went to his first Spanish class. Would you say ayer mi hijo iba a su primera clase de español, o ayer mi hijo fue a su primera clase de español? Of course, this time you'd use the preterit past tense. Ayer mi hijo fue a su primera clase de español. Great work, everyone. So how did you go during those exercises? And can you now see when we start to use the preterit and when we use the imperfect past tense in Spanish? Of course, in terms of the conjugations, that can be a little bit more difficult, getting used to which conjugations to use, obviously with which verbs and matching it up with the appropriate tense at the same time. There's no real shortcut for that in my experience, at least. It just comes down to practice, essentially. What I will do though is I'll leave for regular verbs, I'll leave the conjugations in the description box for you below. So have a practice with that, and you know what to do next. The next time you have a conversation in Spanish, try a few examples or try saying something in the past tense. Of course, more than likely you are going to make a lot of mistakes. I know that, I've made a lot of mistakes, especially when I first started to use the past tense, but ultimately that's how you get better and that's how you start to improve. Apart from that, if I can help with anything else as well, don't hesitate to leave a comment or a question in the comment section below, and I'll of course see you in the next one. Hasta pronto.